Hello and welcome to Atop the Fourth Wall, where bad comics burn. Patreon-sponsored review time again, and we've got another neat one where the majority of my audience probably has never heard of it. Probably. You people keep surprising me. Dan Dare is a very pulpy British sci-fi hero, basically the equivalent of Buck Rogers here in the States. He first premiered in the weekly comic strip magazine Eagle in 1950, following that British comic style of one or two page serialized story told over a long period of time. We've covered something like that several years ago with that Doctor Who Christmas story. You know, the one where the Doctor fights a demon magician with his magic box. I love how old comics just did not give a crap. The titular Dan Dare, full name Daniel McGregor Dare, was a pilot in the Interplanetary Space Fleet, where he would go off on adventures in the solar system and battle aliens. Apparently, despite the goofy pulp ideas about aliens on Mars and Venus and Saturn and whatnot, they apparently did try to follow scientific plausibility, with Arthur C. Clarke acting as a science and plot advisor for the first few months worth of strips. And then when he realized that there were no aliens on Saturn, he was just like, screw it, I'm gonna write my own book about aliens on Saturn, but they come from giant space dominoes. Eagle magazine was originally conceived as kind of an answer to imported American horror comics at the time. The magazine's founder, Marcus Morris, wanted to create children's content that was more wholesome, but still exciting and fun. He met up with a guy named Frank Hampson, who shared his thoughts about a counter to horror titles and, in turn, conceived of Dan Dare and his optimistic, colorful, imaginative future. Apparently, the original idea was for a female detective named Dorothy Dare, no doubt named after Frank's wife, but by the time the Eagle was being prepped for release, the cover story was either going to be a western or a sci-fi, and Frank felt westerns were too limited for a front page feature, so they went with sci-fi. It was very popular throughout the 50s and 60s, though said popularity waned through the end of that second decade, with the creative team changing hands a few times during that. Since its creation, Dan Dare has had various reappearances, reboots, and different continuations of the original strips in the many decades following, doing everything from Dan waking up 200 years later to Grant Morrison reworking the entire concept as a parody of 80s British politics. Surprisingly, there haven't been a lot of live-action adaptations of the character. A CGI cartoon, various radio dramas, but attempts at making movies or TV shows based on it don't seem to stick. Today, the patron has requested we look at the first Dan Dare serial, Voyage to Venus, that was reprinted in 2004, even supplied the scans that I'm using for this one. Apparently, to draw comparisons to another British character, he was described as Biggles in space, which is hilarious to me because a Patreon review from a few years ago was quite literally Biggles in space. So, does Dan Dare still hold up even after 70 years? Well, let's dig into Dan Dare, Pilot of the Future, Voyage to Venus, and see for ourselves.
Linkara's gonna teach you all a lesson you won't learn. Brodsky, you're not the smartest. Life out, you're not an artist. Anyone who's had a bad comic published, it could be your turn. Linkara, he's a man punch, wears a party hat. Linkara, he has a magic gun. Where'd he purchase that? Linkara, coins, robots, Amazon and trucks. Linkara, this comic sucks. Linkara.
Since the scans come from an omnibus, plus the original strips were made over a ton of comic issues, I think we can skip cover analysis here. We open at the headquarters of the Interplanet Space Fleet, some years in the future. Oh man, I can't wait for some years in the future so we can have our own Interplanet Space Fleet. Apparently, it's actually supposed to take place in 1996. Ah, yes, I remember 1996. Pokemon Red and Green, Power Rangers Zeo, all the space flights to other planets. Good times. Ooh, and Sea Baron Jamal. God, I forgot that show even existed. Oh hey, I remember how we had flying cars in the year 1996.
I was promised flying cars.
Despite being the pilot of the future, Dan Dare himself is not piloting this latest launch, the Kingfisher, but instead acting as air traffic control as it heads into space. Well, there she goes, sir. I wonder if she'll ever come back. She'll not be in the danger zone until this time next week, Dan. Until then, she's only on the highway to the danger zone. And apparently, despite having figured out interplanetary travel and flying cars, nobody has solved faster communication, since the guy in charge, Sir Hubert, says they won't know if the Kingfisher will be okay for at least another week. And indeed, a week later, we see Dan at his home with his friend Digby bringing him breakfast. Morning, Digby. Bacon and eggs? Nah, it's nobbut them vitamin blocks again. I made sure to pick out the grape jelly and mustard ones for you, sir. Jumpin' jets, I'll look like a vitamin soon. Dan Dare, vitamin of the future. My remark earlier is actually the problem. Dan is upset that he didn't get to pilot the Kingfisher. Despite being the chief pilot of the fleet, he's only piloting a desk right now and carrying the cans. Dan Dare, aluminum recycler of the future. Dan gets a call to come into headquarters, probably concerning news of the Kingfisher. Dan and Digby hurry out to Dan's Jeep-Eat, jet-propelled gyroscopic jeep. Still a better portmanteau than Quibi. Arriving at Space Fleet HQ, Dan is informed that the Kingfisher just arrived in the same area that the two previous expeditions, the Orion and the Argonaut, had vanished. They're monitoring it the whole time. I was going to make a joke relating to how they were tracking it using radar and radio, but it's actually not that long of a time delay for either one. 2 to 12 minutes for radio, 5 minutes minimum for radar. An eternity when there's a problem, of course, but better than I was expecting, honestly. They're also tracking it on the Astral Viewer, aka the magic view screen that shows the outside of the ship despite a lack of cameras. Speaking of problems, some kind of explosion occurs in their engines that blasts the ship apart. The ground crew doesn't know what could have happened, considering how thorough they've been on mechanical checks of the ship, but Sir Hubert declares that after 3 missions have been lost like this, he's not risking any more lives on Venus expeditions. On their way to a cabinet meeting to discuss what happened, Dan says they have to keep trying to get to Venus, since the scientific teams are convinced that there's air, soil, and water on it. Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. There's no water, but there is air and soil. The air is made of sulfuric acid and carbon dioxide, and the soil is volcanic and it's hot enough to melt lead, but sure, 2 out of 3. I kid. It was actually popularly believed by science until around the 1960s that Venus had similar conditions to Earth, so this was just following what they had at the time. Less accurate is the belief that since the world population has doubled since the 1950s, they need new food supplies to feed it. In 1950, the estimated world population was 2.5 billion. We're currently at 7.8 billion in 2020, and could actually feed everyone. It's just like everything else, greed and stupidity get into it. But yeah, because they can't grow enough food on Earth, they need the purported resources of Venus to continue to sustain the population. Dan's working theory about what happened to the Kingfisher is in the engine design of their ships. They use impulse waves transmitted from Earth, the Moon, and Mars that are stored in batteries on the ship and fed into the engines. The Kingfisher reported something wrong in their impulse cylinders right before it exploded, so they think there's something around Venus that screws up the impulse waves and causes them to go blammo. As such, they decide to build a new ship utilizing old-school fuel tanks for the job, and Dan is gung-ho about piloting it, which they finally accept. 3 months later, their ship is complete. What do you think of her, Dan? Only one way to find out, sir. Let's take her up. Be careful, Dan. She's had no routing tests yet. We'll take a chance. Oh, yeah, it's only interplanetary spaceflight using antiquated techniques for a mission that's killed 3 prior ships in a vessel that took 3 months to build. There's no need to do any testing. Actually, I guess this is the test, because in the next page, Dan's flying it around, and apparently this thing is designed so that you fly it by lying on your stomach. Oh, that's just because Dan needs to be worked on by a masseuse of the future. Dan lands it at another facility where they're trying to recruit 2 of their pals, Hank and Pierre, to accompany them. It'll be a 6-person team. Dan, Digby, Sir Hubert, Hank and Pierre, and a scientist named Professor Peabody. And the professor soon walks in. To everyone's shock and horror, the professor's a woman! Sure, they may have united the world under a single government, created interplanetary spaceflight, and can transmit energy waves through space from Mars, but girls have boobs and stuff! I don't see what all the fuss is about, Sir Hubert. I'm a first-class geologist, botanist, agriculturalist, and the cabinet agree that I'm the best person to reconnoiter Venus as a source of food. I'm a qualified space pilot as well.
Yeah, but you've got, like, fallopian tubes and a vagina. How are we expected to be professional on this scientific endeavor when you've just got those existing in the same space as us?
Sir Hubert tries to call the cabinet to get her reassigned, but they say it's a direct order to bring her.
Women! Pah! Stupid women and their ovaries! Now this trip isn't going to be any fun at all.
A week later, they launch, using one larger ship to propel them most of the way to Venus, and in turn, they'll launch 3 smaller, 2-person craft out towards the planet. Sir Hubert took Professor Peabody with him to
make sure she doesn't get in the way.
Yeah, women and their wombs keep getting in the way of piloting spacecraft, am I right? And actually, Peabody has taken the controls herself, much to Sir Hubert's annoyance.
Miss Peabody, I insist that you come away from those controls immediately. That's an order.
I'm sorry, Sir Hubert, but you're not as young as you used to be, and we may need steady nerves on this job. Sexism, ageism, hey, let's throw some racism in there too. Notice how in the future, where supposedly the entire world's united, everybody's pasty white?
Very well, Miss Peabody. You will pilot the ship, but once we reach Venus, you will please consider yourself under arrest for insubordination.
Man, you are such a tight ass that we could try to compress coal into diamonds in there, but they'd get stuck. While their engines manage to make it past the field, their radios explode, since no one apparently realized that those utilize the impulse waves too. Unfortunately, the explosion on Dan and Digby's ship causes enough damage to force our heroes to bail out, though since they've reached the atmosphere, they're able to parachute to the surface, or rather the water.
It would interest Professor Peabody to know there is water on Venus, even if it is an unusual color.
The moon is made of cheese, and Venus is made of orange juice. Dan and Digby are separated, with our title character engaging with some kind of sea monster.
This is no way to welcome guests, you refugee from Loch Ness.
Technically speaking, Dan, you're less a guest and more an invader. He uses his paralyzing pistol to disable the creature and meets up with Digby.
I don't see any bus stops around here or snack bars, and yet the brochure said there was a very active nightlife.
The group is supposed to meet up at a specific point if they all made it in. One of the other ships may get through, and we had planned a rendezvous in the permanent Twilight Zone. Submitted for your approval. 5 brave men and 1 brave woman traversing the surface of Venus, with no way of knowing what awaits them. File under D for Dan and D for Dare in the permanent part of the Twilight Zone. They convert some trees and one of their parachutes into a makeshift raft for them to travel along the water to the rendezvous point, leaving behind a message in case anyone comes across it later, with the very important ending bit, "Long live Wygan," because when you're the first human beings to land on this planet, best to leave a message to let everyone know what town you're from. After reaching the end of the water, they begin making their way across the alien jungle of Venus, though they soon come across a cave that looks like it was artificially carved. While they explore it, it seems a native of Venus, this blue dude in a Tarzan-esque loincloth, spots them and runs back to town to warn his people. And I guess Venus has quite a disparity in fashion, since while this dude has his cheetah print caveman look, the guys in town are wearing these weird Roman centurion-inspired uniforms. There's even this olive-colored dude with the fanciest of golden hats. Venusians dispatch their own flying cars, while back in the cave, Dan discovers some hieroglyphs on the walls. There's a remarkable resemblance to ancient Egyptian art, don't you think so, Dig? Great, it's gonna turn out they found the Goa'uld. Digby must have hit his head or something in the fall, since he cares more about playing with some alien lizards and then being put off when they run away from him. He spots the approaching Venusians.
Don't look now, sir, but I think we've been followed by a bunch of overgrown blue bottles.
This is a weird remake of Avatar. He thinks they look hostile and decides to pull his gun, but Dan wants to try to talk to them, especially since, this is first contact with an alien species, you dumbass.
Don't be so daft, sir. The only talking you'll do to that bunch of heathens will be famous last words, and they won't appreciate them.
Digby, bigoted colonizer of the future! Unfortunately, the Venusians do seem to be hostile as they fire at Dan, forcing Digby to shoot the paralyzer at them. The ones not hit by it flee. They find the flying cars they used to get there, but it turns out to be an ambush to grab our heroes. They're brought back to the Venusian city and their helmets removed, revealing an oxygen atmosphere for them. Their leader is this much more alien-looking guy, a member of a race called the Treen, who reveals he knows who they are. We have studied the Earth for 26,000 years, and every Treen child knows all its languages. For example, I am fluent in both HTML and Jive. The Treen reveals them monitoring the remaining 2 spacecraft, which have coordinated and figured out the issue with the radio. They plan to jettison their radios and try to come in. What's more, the Treen reveals that the blue guys, they really are humans.
You mean those blue jobs came from Earth?
Their ancestors were brought back for Earth research from a spaceship survey 15,000 years ago, taken from a place known as Smurf Village. The blue people speak only their own language and have a tendency to attack outsiders, hence what happened to them. For some reason, the scans of the next page are very worn out and not fixed, so some of the dialogue is very difficult to read. What I get is that unfortunately the other 2 ships are headed for a much more inhospitable part of the planet that the Treen don't normally go to, and that they regularly do not have contact with the southern hemisphere, which seems really odd, especially since they use electromagnetic tubes to transport people across the surface of the planet, as they do with our heroes, and bring them to a city called Mikanta. Here we are, gentlemen, the finest city on Venus. Property taxes are absurdly high here. They even have their own Scooty Puff Juniors to transport people shorter distances, as we see here with Digby riding on one and then getting dropped off in another part of the city. This comic is a great representation of what it's like to play Star Wars: The Old Republic. The 2 are brought to more of the Treen for interrogation. And shall we say, experiment? We're going to launch you into space and force you to watch bad movies. For whatever reason, the 2 other ships are being pulled into the flame belt around the middle of the planet. Hank and Pierre's ship manages to pull up in time, but Sir Hubert, in his infinite wisdom, pushes Peabody out of the flight seat so he can take the helm, and is unable to pull it out because he's an idiot. The Treen director tells Dan and Digby that they've been brought here for research, but will be sent for nourishment for the time being. Apparently they have food baths that will just let them absorb nutrients through their skin. Digby remains his bigoted self, but Dan is still hoping to reach a peaceful settlement for the Venusians to supply food to the Earth. They elect to take some Space Fleet uniforms from a museum of Earth stuff that the Treen have so that they can feel more confident about negotiations. Always a good opening move for diplomacy when you swipe stuff from their museum. The 2 are brought back to the director for experimentation and study, and his enormous hat with fins on it. Why the hell does he have the fins? Does it make it more aerodynamic?
There. Sure glad I don't look stupid in this.
Dan demands to speak to their leader as an official envoy of Earth. You mean the Mikon of Mikanta? The supreme scientist? The illustrious first one of Venus? Look, director, you can just call him Gary. He's been trying to discourage all the titles. Obscure insects from backwater planets such as yours would not even be allowed to enter the same building as the magnificent brain. His hat is even sillier and taller than mine. As the 2 are loaded onto a slab, an underling informs the director of the 3rd rocket about to land on the Flamelands. We have 2 specimens. We do not need more. But one of these is a woman, no master. A woman? You backwards humans! Don't you know that their breasts get in the way of science? The 2 are released so the Treen can observe their reactions to watching the ship be destroyed. Fortunately, they actually do manage to crash land, though it's in the middle of some quicksand. Admittedly, it's not actually going so quick, but they're still stuck in the middle of a lake of the stuff, and Hubert suggests it'll only take about 48 hours to sink them completely. And just to make life even more horrible, the glass mountain they passed on the way is actually some kind of silicon-based life form that consumes living things, and it starts moving towards them. Really what I'm getting from this story is don't fly to Venus under any circumstances. Back with Dan and Digby, they want the 2 to be rescued, but the director shrugs off their concerns. However, one of his assistants says that if they had 4 specimens, 2 could be fully dissected. So suddenly they're on board with the idea. Dan and Digby are sent to the Museum of Machines to acquire a vehicle to take them there, transported via teleporter, or a telesender as they call it. Don't be afraid of the telesender, spaceman. You will simply be disintegrated in that cabinet, transmitted by radio, and reassembled in a similar cabinet at the Museum of Transport. So you have instantaneous teleportation, but you can't talk to the other side of the planet? As Sir Hubert finally apologizes to Professor Peabody for being such a colossal douche canoe, especially since she's keeping a more level head than he is given the circumstances, Dan and Digby select a special jet-propelled helicopter to bring them to the others, a Treen serving as their pilot and guard. Digby gets an idea about the pilot.
I just thought of something, sir. If he's 10% taller, we're 10% stronger. It's just a question of gravity.
Of course! Don't you know anything about science?
Dan tells him to hold his horses until they rescue the others. He also tries to make friends with the pilot, but he's not taken.
The shaking of hands is an Earth custom that seems illogical to us.
An ancient gesture to show one does not carry arms, also used before boxing matches and by businessmen about to cheat one another. Well, if that doesn't work for you, I know another gesture of greeting that'll work. Fortunately, they arrive and rescue the two in the nick of time, using a special fluorine compound to deal with the silicon blob. They compare notes a bit, but the silicon creature attacks again, grabbing hold of the rope ladder they used to rescue the others. They soon realize they can release the rope ladder drum to get loose, but they need to free up some slack, which the pilot refuses to do, just continually trying to lift the copter up. Finally, Dan just punches him and takes control, allowing them to get free. The Treen grabs an inanimate carbon rod to try to defend himself, but fortunately, Dan Dare knows jujitsu, which allows him to flip the guy over.
Little thing called jujitsu. We inferior beings find it very useful for dealing with bullies.
He then punches him. Although that one wasn't jujitsu, it's an ancient technique called punching you in the face. The other Treens, monitoring this, create artificial tornadoes to block their escape. While they try to evade them, the Treen pilot, named Sondar, mentions that they're all in trouble now, him included, because he showed emotion earlier by being afraid of the blob, and thus they'll want to experiment on him to find out the fault. Still, he doesn't want to help them since he believes that they should be proud to serve Treen research.
By the Mekon, it's like you guys don't even want to be dissected.
The tornadoes force them to crash, though the plant life cushions the fall. They make their way towards where they hope Hank and Pierre landed. After dealing with a giant snake creature that threatens Sondar, he wants to know why they saved him from it, or why they haven't killed him already.
We do not understand unscientific actions, and murdering defenseless prisoners is totally scientific.
After they inform him that there's more to life than applied science, to his confusion, we get a neat little interlude with a fake newspaper talking about the missing astronauts, even photographs of real people, along with a bunch of other articles. Senator demands vitamin eat probe. Demands to know why product has such a terrible name. There's even an advertisement to live on Mars, with the slogan, "Get your ass to Mars." The next part of the interlude shows how bad things are on Earth. Ration supplies breaking down, leading to riots, cuts in certain rationing areas to help others, and how the vitamin eat things are only a short-term substitute for proper nutrients. Our heroes, meanwhile, have found fresh food growing in the forest, Professor Peabody having tools that confirm they're safe to eat. Sondar continues to be confused by their attitudes and explains to them that the humans are of interest to the Treens because they're thinking about taking over the Earth and don't know if it's worth it to them to do so. You'd think studying us for tens of thousands of years would help them make a call on that. They're intercepted by more Treen, but thanks to being armed with paralyzing pistols, the group are able to fight back. Sondar even joins our heroes in taking a swing at them, though Digby gets hit by Rover from the prisoner. In the struggle, Sir Hubert accidentally shoots Dan with his paralyzer gun, sending him over a cliff and into the water below.
Dan! Oh, my hat! I got Dan! This wouldn't have happened if I had my hat with me!
In any case, they recapture everyone save for Dan, who's carried underground by the current of the river below. Once back in the city, Sondar covers for them, claiming that there wasn't an escape attempt, just an accident in a helicopter.
There are no accidents in a scientific state, nor is there failure.
Oh yeah? Then how do you explain that thing on your head?